After nearly a year of lockdowns, mandatory store closures, and people working from home, it's becoming more difficult to envision what retail will look like when we finally get past the pandemic. Right now, workout gear, yoga pants, hoodies, and comfy tops are bestsellers. And shopping online is not just the channel of choice. For many, it's the only choice. The question on most of our minds is, when will retail finally rebound? And what will consumers want to buy as life gets back to normal? So I got in touch with retail expert Tom Ott to get an insider's view of what retail will look like as we emerge from the strange days of COVID. During Tom's impressive 24-year career at Saks Fifth Avenue, he was Senior Vice President and GMM of Men's Gifts and Home. He then went on to be Chief Merchant at Saks Fifth Avenue off Fifth. After leaving Saks, Tom became Chief at Retail and Fashion Solutions, which provides strategic solutions for retail and fashion companies. Recently, he launched Retail Czar, an e-commerce platform. I'm Jane Singer, and welcome to A Seat at the Table. Today, Tom is sharing his outlook for what consumers are going to want as we head into healthier times, and why. Spoiler alert, there's a lot of good news, especially for menswear. Tom will talk about his view on how physical retail might fare in a world where e-commerce has seen a year of skyrocketing growth. Before we jump into our podcast, I'd like to suggest that if you're struggling to get your sourcing forecast done, the current situation in sourcing is the answer to your prayers. It provides a sharp and concise snapshot of the situation in major sourcing nations, along with key data, in an easy-to-read format, of course. You can find details in the show notes. Now, let's hear what Tom has to say about retail. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that everyone right now is very, I would say, at the best confused and probably at the worst anxious about what's happening at retail. In addition to, of course, we wonder how and when retail will rebound. I think that there's a lot of questions about what retail will look like as we come out of the pandemic. I'm really looking forward to your views on this because you have such a long experience in the retail sector.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Thanks for having me. So I think that this is probably one of the most exciting times in retail. So, right now, I think it's probably the worst that it's going to be, in the United States and probably most of the world. Very difficult. Customers are hesitant to go into stores. And also, you also have the double impact of high unemployment. So the consumer right now is very cautious. And what we're seeing is that the business is kind of headed in two different directions. The discounters and the very low-end stores in the United States are doing really quite well. Mm-hmm. And then at the top end of the spectrum, the luxury continues to perform.
Right.
And I think as we go through this fourth quarter, with an eye towards vaccine coming out and post-pandemic, I think that what we're going to see is a very changed landscape for sure. My viewpoint is that you'll probably have 4 different segments that'll evolve in the business. So naturally, e-com continuing to grow and take market share. Mm-hmm. I do think as we get into the second quarter, we'll see the brick and mortar business really rebound. So as tourists feel comfortable in coming back to cities and move around, I think that you'll see that natural tendency to want to be with other human beings, to have that interaction. And, really, I think the top end will really perform quite well because the customer wants that interaction from a stylist, wants to understand why something costs so much. So I think that part of it will go. And then I think in between, there's 2 emerging parts of the business. One is websites that will be using stylists. So stylists that are out in the field that can use the website as home base and can give individualized service and styling tips with the customer, how the customer feels comfortable, either via email, a Zoom call, or, if they're up to it, a personal visit. And then the second component that we're seeing as a new part of the business is whether it's the pop-up or the kiosk. So I think, again, as traffic starts to increase, you'll see a lot of small retailers or DTC brands that will look at either the pop-up in the huge vacancy of stores that are out there, or a new emerging form of a kiosk, that's in a mall, and you really could bring an e-commerce player to life so the customer could touch product and feel.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that everyone is going to be looking to see how they can adapt to some of the things that have happened during the pandemic. Well, I think that what we've seen over the past decade, even before the pandemic, and you touched upon this just before, is the market has become so polarized between either very, very high-end or mass market. Is there any room at all for what we used to call better or mid-tier to come back?
I think so. I think, one of the conversations I've been having recently is people asking, what's going to happen with the department store, post-pandemic. So we saw so many closures, between a Macy's, JCPenney closing stores, so many companies, folding up shop.
Right.
And, I would argue that most of it is, or a large part of it, I should say, is, I think, self-inflicted with merchandise assortments in the stores. So what's happened is it's become a vast sameness. So there's such a dependency on big brands. And
Right.
oftentimes, if you would go and close your eyes in one department store and walk to another one and open them, they would look much the same, because it would be the same brands, the same shop and shops, the same build outs, same product. And
Exactly.
I would argue that if you don't have a unique offering, there's not a reason for a customer to come to you. So I think when you look back to yesteryear, with all of the major department stores that you saw, really around the world, I think that there was, a true merchant feeling with these stores, and they would go out and source the best product in the world that they could bring home.
Right.
And it wasn't just a flight to safety with these big designer brands. It was much about discovery and finding something new, something that was different and would cater to your particular audience. So to answer your question, do I think that there's an opportunity to be in the middle? And I would say yes. I think there's an opportunity to be in the middle with special, unique brands that offer, style, quality, and value.
But do you think that department stores at this point, because obviously when you're with the big brands, you have you have a lot more flexibility, right? They'll take back what doesn't sell. They provide advertising money. Do you see that that's realistic, that existing department stores will be able to go back to that formula? Because that was certainly, as you said, a winning formula. You provided sort of a treasure trove when the customer came in to find unique things that weren't available elsewhere.
So I would tell you that I think it is possible. At the end of the day, the vendor community has to absorb all of those costs. And what's really started to happen of late is even that those big department store brands have really started to push back, and they're not paying all of the chargebacks. They're not paying all of the advertising money. And it's really left the big brands, between a rock and a hard place. I've had conversations with some of these big brands that actually make more profitability with the pure discounters than they do with the big department stores, because they know what the price is, and at the end of the day, that's what the price is, and they don't have losses. So I think for the department stores, the key is in sourcing. And I would tell you from experience, the magic number is about 80% markup. So if you can operate on 80% markup, it allows for your advertising, it allows for the markdowns that are going to be incurred, it allows for you to move on and clear the merchandise and move to the new season. And indeed, it is possible. You just have to work at it. And, what's really important there before, and I mentioned before, is, what I would say, a true merchant organization. So, sourcing is key and is paramount, and you really need to have boots on the ground, all over the world to seek out the best sourcing for your product.
And yet just about every department store, certainly in the U.S. and many of the ones overseas, have not been able to make that work in recent years.
I would say yes and no. Well, I would tell you from recent experience, so at Saks Fifth Avenue, where I was, most recently, we started our own private label program in men's. So we called it the Saks Fifth Avenue Men's Collection. And we started it from zero. We in 3 years, we grew it to be a $50 million business. It was our largest business that we had. Our margin was at 50 points, and we were able to do it and do it successfully. We built an organization, so we had specialists in the stores. Twice a year, we would take our group to Las Vegas and we would browbeat them on features and benefits of the product so that they would know when contacting their clients, what was the reason for being. And, we had arguably the best quality and value that was on the selling floor. So we worked with a bunch of agents throughout Europe in sourcing our product. We had great factories in Asia. So I would tell you that indeed it was possible. It was my most profitable and my biggest vendor. And, this was, in 2018. So it can be done. I would tell you, Macy's Merchandising Corp does a wonderful job. They have a terrific reputation out there. They just came out most recently in their last quarter with an initiative to drive $5 billion worth of new private brand, private label business through Macy's. So I think that they're realizing what we're talking about. And, JCPenney, just before they had all of their problems that were really, I think, brought on by the pandemic, I think they were rounding the corner on this very subject. I actually visited their private label, private brand studio here in New York. So their headquarters was in Plano, Texas. They moved their private label, private brand office to New York City. They had a 5-floor building on Lafayette, and it was filled with all young, cool, hip people to scour the world. And not only were they doing product just for JCPenney, we were looking at them at Saks to do one of our programs.
Wow.
So I think that it is an emerging zone for sure. And I think it can be done. You're correct. There was a period of time where it was really the cheapest product on the floor was private label. It was a sale vehicle. It didn't have much style. That was really probably say, that was a big part of the problem. But I think the stores realize now, instead of being the worst, it's something that you put your name on, you should be the most proud of it. And, again, it drives that exclusivity and, differentiated product. And if you can get your selling organization behind your own product as well, wow, it's really great. So when a customer comes walking through, and they're like, hey, what should I buy? What looks good? And they take them to your private label, private brand because they believe you really can drive margin.
That's really interesting.
Do you think that it's best for department stores to be focusing more on private label? I know that, of course, if you rely too heavily on national brands, everybody has the same thing, as you were saying before, and that's very true. You end up with a sea of sameness. But what about the role for smaller brands that might have an exclusive with your store? Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. So I think it's all about balance. So I think that, I can't answer for all stores. In my head, it's about 25% is private label. I think for having probably, call it, half of your assortment as private brands, and whether those brands are in-house brands or exclusive brands that you work with in the marketplace, I think that drives it. And then, of course, you're going to need the big brands, but I think when you buy the big brands, is there exclusive offerings within them? Is there something that's differentiated within those big brands? So if you want to buy something that's special, it brings them in. And I think that it's about product development. And I think, we've seen lately, what really worries me is today's buying, when it's on a Zoom call, there's no touch and feel. My sense is, where some of the business is headed with people that are more concentrating just on numbers, is so many positions have been eliminated in the buying offices. Some of the people are just scrambling to keep their head above the waves. So let alone think about exclusives and touching product and driving business. So I think that that's really key and paramount is to work with small upcoming brands to do something that's special. Maybe it's 10, 15% should be, small emerging brands. I also believe that there is a responsibility of the big stores to help in our business in developing small brands. So the days of yesteryear, somebody would really notice talent and take them under their wings. Barney's in particular was really terrific at that, where they would find great brands throughout the world. They would nurture them, help grow them. And I think that that's something that's missing, today. At our business, my business, retailczar.com, we're trying to do that more and more. So we have 70 brands that are on our site, and those brands are all small, differentiated, and they're not household names. And that's something that, we really are trying to pride ourselves with. So I think it's important.
Yeah, I think I think you're right. I think that you need, like you said, to have some of your anchor brands, but at the same time, even if it is a different collection, but it's from the same name, the consumer oftentimes says, well, I can get this brand here, I can get it there. So having those small niche brands plus a balance of private label is an ideal mix that would probably bring people back.
Now, looking at the menswear sector, a lot of people feel that there's been this migration to casual wear and that formal menswear is never coming back. By that I mean suits and ties, or even suits with no ties. What's your take on that?
So I think, clearly great change there. There was a whole casualization that's been happening for the last 2 decades. A lot of people think that the suit is going to go the way of the top hat. And it's just that movement of the way that people dress. I would think, again, it's someplace in between. So I would tell you that, right now with this huge casualization, that's occurring, mostly because of the pandemic, it's not going to continue. I could tell you already, I've been traveling into New York City for the last 2.5 months, and you care about the way that you're dressed. And it's just a matter of fact. When you're interfacing with other people, they do care. And my opinion is that, even if it comes down to a tiebreaker, so if it's you and somebody else and somebody has to make a decision as to who that they're going to either invest money with or who they're going to hire for a job, I say odds are that it's typically going to be with the guy that put on a suit and a tie as opposed to a concert T-shirt and a pair of jeans. And I think that that's a fact. I think that dressing in men's, and I think in women's as well, is going to be, really emerging from this. And there's going to be a reason that people are going to want to celebrate. Again, God willing, post-vaccine, we start to travel. People enjoy going out together, parties, going on cruises. People are going to look in a closet and there's going to be a sea of sweatsuits. So they're going to need to get out there and buy something that's new, different. I think one thing for sure that's going to be with us is comfort. So whether it's stretch and innovation in fabric, which already started pre-pandemic, I think you'll see an acceleration there. I think you're going to see color like you've never seen before, because I think that people are going to want to be wear something bright and fun. And I think in menswear, I think that you're going to see the reemergence of the sport coat. So, sport coat business pre-pandemic was really fantastic. So it's a way for a guy to have some individual expression. So you saw guys with style that would wear color. And at the end of the day, a guy needs a place to put his phone, his keys, and his wallet. So it almost becomes out of necessity. So I think that you're going to start to see that. Somebody asked me recently, where do I see men's fashion going for next fall? And it was the first time for me in a little bit that I thought about it. When I was with Saks, that was a ritual for me for 24 years to think about, okay, what are we going to do and how are we going to define the way that Saks looks? And now with the pandemic and so forth, it was just really about survival. But as someone asked me about it, starting to think about next fall and where I see it going, I think that you're going to see a little bit of, I would call it smartness in a way that a guy's going to dress. I think that he's going to want to be a little bit cleaned up. He's going to want to wear a little bit of color. I think he's going to want to have something that's comfortable, but he's going to want to make an impression. And I think it'll be silhouettes that are a little bit closer to the body, that'll be a little bit cleaned up. And I think you'll see this influence from the pandemic, between comfort, this idea, the jogger, which was pre-pandemic. I think you'll see that accelerate. And I think that you will see a reemergence in denim. I think that denim really took a little bit of a hiatus during the pandemic. And I think that you'll see it come back, as a guy wants something again where it'll be comfortable, easy to put on, but at the same time, I think to have the pockets and be able to have some place to put things is also important. And I think footwear is an area of really a lot of change and a lot of interest. So, the whole sneaker phenomenon is on fire. designer sneakers is amongst the best trending areas in the stores right now. I think that you're going to see a push towards loafers, drivers, and what's really making big inroads is hybrids. So really that kind of hiker sneaker look. And I think you'll see that really explode as we go into the summer next fall.
Wow, that'll be really interesting. And it's great to hear that loungewear is not going to be the new career wear, because so many people are predicting that, well, everyone's just going to be wearing leggings or basically sweatpants, and that's going to be that, working from home in those kind of clothes. So it's very good to hear this. This is only going to be a temporary situation.
Well, I think the other part of it is that it's not going to be for every career for sure. I think this casualization, there'll be parts that will be impacted, but I think you're going to see the designer world, really push to make fashion important. And, really to get out there and tell people it matters what you look like. And it's not just about body covering.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that we've had sort of a break from being focused just on the catwalks, because, of course, this year it was very difficult for them to have that. So maybe it's an opportunity for brands to, instead of just copying what everybody else is doing, to come through and bring their own creativity in. Of course, you'd have to have retailers as well who feel confident to back somebody who has their own look. But I think that would be very refreshing, because like you said, the amount of sameness has not been a good thing.
Exactly.
So if you're looking at physical retail, which everybody says is going to go the way of the horse-drawn cart, because not only was e-commerce rising, but with the pandemic, everybody was forced really to shop online, with stores being closed or social distancing measures and so forth. So there's a lot of conversation that says people just aren't going to return to stores because they're just used to shopping online, and they're just not going to want to do that. So what are you seeing in that regard?
I think there's no question. And, again, I own an e-commerce business, so I believe in it. I think it's here to stay. I think it's, fantastic. It'll continue to grow. Still less than 30% of apparel sales is done online. So said another way, 70% is coming from physical stores. So it's still tremendously important. And I think that it will come back again. And again, I think much of it is about, if you build it, they will come. So if you have terrific assortments and you have great people in the store, people will show up. And I think that that's important. And I think that we also really, as an industry, got away from having retail sellers as a career. So there used to be a time period where that was a respectable living, and people took pride in the way that they operated, the standards that were set up in the store. And as an industry, we got away from that. I would tell you, the best sellers in the industry, they're almost like not even impacted right now from the pandemic. I could tell you stories all day about the best sellers that I've worked with in my career, and it's pretty unbelievable. If you've ever shopped with a great seller, it's a great experience. And for many people, they're so busy and they just don't have the time to shop. And also to have somebody that is so knowledgeable on fits, on style, and will give you honest feedback. And the best reinforcement is when somebody says to you when you go to the office or to a party, wow, you look great. What a great feeling. And then to have that confidence that when I go to the stylist or the associate that I work with, they are able to really transform me. I think that that's a big part of what's missing right now, and a big part of the demise of the physical stores. I also would say that, obviously right now, as we just were saying, a lot of it is that sameness in the product offering. So that's another part of the problem. I think that stores will come back. I think that that they'll come back, because of all the reasons that we've been talking about, and I think that they will come back. I think that they will be important. And I would argue that I think you're going to see, across the country, the reemergence of the specialty store. I would tell you through this pandemic, I've talked a lot to them, and it's been a lot of specialty stores throughout the country, and it's been very difficult. But those are the ones that have the greatest relationships with their clients. And, they've stayed in contact with them.
Excuse me, I just wanted to ask you, when you say specialty stores, would it be a single brand concept store or would it be a multi-brand store?
It would be a single brand store. So for instance, I live neighboring town is Greenwich, Connecticut. So we have a company called Mitchell's Richards, and Mitchell's and Richards is a family run company. They've been in business since I believe the 1970s. They do tremendous volume. They have a physical plant in Greenwich, Connecticut, and then in Westport, Connecticut, and they do significant volume. Wonderful family, so in contact with what's happening, so charitable. And it's been very difficult for them, the business. But I would tell you, my money's on them post-pandemic, that their business is going to come raging back because, again, their connections with the client, and being focused on the client, the product for them, and really understanding the marketplace. And, again, that's something I think that's missing around. So those mom and pop shops, I think that really can weather the storm, will come back the strongest. I think you'll see that in a big way.
Yeah, I think that's really good to hear. So they're carrying their own brand. So in other words, it's private label under their name and in their stores.
They do a lot of the big brands, so it's a mix. So they'll do some things that are exclusive to them. And as we discussed before, they'll do small differentiated brands, but they do also carry the big brands in those stores, but buy it in such a way that it's edited to their customer. It's very special. There might be exclusive items within those collections just for Mitchell's and Richards.
I can remember when I was growing up that there were a lot of menswear stores that offered excellent service and that also provided a very well-edited merchandise selection. Unfortunately, I can never remember any such thing for women.
Men had that a lot longer, where you had a salesman who knew you, they would do alterations for you in the store and help you. Women's, I think, has always been, I don't know why, but certainly within my lifetime, I can't remember that you had that service.
Yeah, there's a couple of them around. They're out there. I think menswear a little bit more, maybe richer heritage there. But, some of them out there around the country in women's. I just think that segment is one that I think we're going to see really grow. If anything, I think that's what's going to be born out of this pandemic is a little bit more of, I would say, the butcher, baker, and shoemaker. So a little bit more about the mom and pops on the street, about specialists. I think that, a lot of it is generational. I think the baby boomers, the older baby boomers kind of grew up with this. They expect this. They understand this. And, I think that group just most recently, a lot of the stock market is getting moved from this group. So they ain't dead yet. And I think they're really, they still have a lot of disposable income and, they can make moves. But I think, in the movement to the millennials and younger, I think it's going to be for them to define how business is done with specialty stores. And I've seen it where young people who really take the art of the sale very seriously, they succeed so much more. So for instance, to get involved with texting their customers, WhatsApp, and then also now TikTok, and to use those means of communication to their clients, unbelievable. I think that we're going to see tremendous growth in clienteling and the art of the sale in the go forward. This is something that a lot of the mono brand stores, designer stores, really picked up on and training their associates, and they picked up on this. I think, next is really going to be for multi-brand stores, to really get it. To do business online is very expensive. And, the costs involved with pick, pack, shipping, and then, digital marketing, the costs are huge.
Yeah.
Stores are much, much more profitable. And the other part of it is, the job creation. And, so for young people now, where it's very difficult for them to get, in many cases, into the working world, what a great way to be a seller and really take pride and work for a company, have great relationships with clients. And I've seen it many times. You could sell $1 million. You're fast approaching that salary of over $100,000. You're doing really quite well. So I think you're going to see a lot of development and change in our industry in brick and mortar.
It's interesting that you say that because everyone has been talking about e-commerce as saying, wow, would this be great? Because from the point of view of people who realistically should know better, they feel that by not having to maintain a physical presence and having sales assistants on the floor and so forth, that it will be a huge savings and that online is vastly more profitable. So it's interesting that you're pointing out that actually e-commerce has its costs as well.
Yeah, and what's really, I think, quite interesting is I had some colleagues on the ground in India, and it was interesting because I felt as though when I was talking with them that it was like retail future for the States. And it was a period of time, the way they described it to me, that there was this dramatic growth in e-commerce. And then what ended up happening is that people realize there's certain costs there, and you actually could be cheaper on prices in brick and mortar. So you had this kind of ebb and flow of the business where, there was a flight to e-com, and then everybody's like, wait a second, we could do this cheaper and better in stores. And, the wave went back to stores. So I think it's going to be a balancing act, in the go forward. And I think that you're going to see a leveling out. And it's almost like Star Wars episodes. And I think, the next one will be, Return of the Stores.
Well, yeah, I believe you're right. I certainly am very bullish on e-commerce. And I think that there's huge opportunities for people, certainly to reach people who are not located near your store or to be able to do cross-border. But I think at the same time, like you said, people need that human connection with other people, with products, and a store is a destination. It's something to do. I mean, maybe for those of us who work in this industry, we don't feel like going to a store and looking at clothes on our free time if that's what we're doing all day long. But for people who work in other sectors, there's an enjoyment of going and browsing and seeing what's new, and just like you're saying, you want that connection. You can have a stylist online, but to be able to be face to face, it's a different feeling.
Absolutely.
Looking beyond this pandemic, and it will end sooner or later, what do you see as the big opportunity for retail? I know we've talked about a lot of different things that you see as coming back and definitely reemerging, but if you were to look at retail as a whole right now, what would you identify as the next big thing that you feel is like, wow, this is going to be just a huge opportunity?
I think it's about finding the it items that will really drive business. And, we really haven't seen it in a long time, even pre-pandemic. So like if you look back, Giorgio Armani and American Gigolo, whoa, like you had to go out, you had to buy Armani. And, you saw, some of the other great American designers, Ralph Lauren. And my sense is, you're going to see somebody, who's young, that's going to lead this creative excitement. Something really is going to come out of this pandemic that's going to be, really quite exciting in fashion. You look back on the timeline and, you look for periods where either angst or strife or whatever drove creative genius. And, probably the last time was, or one time I should say, was in the late 60s in the United States, with all the social unrest and so forth. Look at all the music that came out of that time period between the Beatles and, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was all led by, young people with creative genius. And I think coming out of this pandemic, my sense, it'll be similar. So whether it's going to be in music, the arts, and I think fashion. And, I think, again, you have the ingredients. You can, if you were a chef, you could see all the ingredients scattered around, the oven. So between this element of casualization that occurred during the pandemic, again, social unrest, et cetera, around the world. And I think that you're going to want to see people want to celebrate. They are sick and tired of being sick and tired, and they're going to look to make a move. So I think you're going to see really, similar to during the period post the Spanish flu, the Roaring 20s.
Right.
We're ready for the next version of the Roaring 20s. It was a period where dress, celebration, etc. You go back and you look for cues, and this is what occurred. So I think that's what's going to happen. What those items are, I don't know. I am on the lookout for them. For Retail Czar, we're out there pushing. And I think that's, why you really want to have a merchant group that's out there now, not hiding, thinking about the pandemic as a time period to lay on the couch. You want them out there online, looking for what's next, communicating in the industry. And then, when things start to open up, they're going to have to get traveling, see what's going on, and make something happen. But I think what's exciting is if you do, my sense is the payback will be maybe, generational. That's how much business I think is going to come back. I think it's going to be raging.
Wow, that's really exciting. And that's such good news because leading up to the pandemic, business was so tough for so many people. And then the pandemic hit. So I think everybody in the industry is feeling a little bit down on their uppers. So it's just wonderful to hear that you see such opportunity coming back and that it'll be sort of a burst of energy throughout for creativity and people getting back out and communicating with each other and socializing. It's really good to hear. So thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you. It was great to spend. Great to spend some time, and hopefully, all that we talked about comes true.
Thanks again, and I really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe to our podcast so you'll never miss another episode? And if you're struggling to get your sourcing forecast report done, the current situation in sourcing is the answer to your prayers. It provides a sharp and concise snapshot of the situation in major sourcing nations along with key data in an easy-to-read format, of course. You can find details in the show notes for this podcast. Thank you, and see you in the next podcast.